Hello friends, my name is Emile and welcome back to some more Forza Top Gear laps. Today we're going to be looking at some more random cars, this time from the class of B. Let's get straight into this with the Lamborghini Countach, 455 horsepower, 3,284 pounds of weight. This is the most powerful car here today, and judging by Lamborghini's track record when it comes to this track, this car should do pretty darn well. Lamborghinis in the past have always been very quick around this track. The Countach, to drive, honestly, I wasn't a huge fan of this vehicle. It felt extremely heavy. It only weighs 3,284 pounds, and most modern Lamborghinis are coming close to about 4,000 pounds. So I don't really know why the Countach felt as heavy as it did, but it was pretty heavy. Straight line speed was decent enough from the Countach. It was an okay car to drive. I think if this thing was built up correctly as a race car, it could probably be pretty good. As it stands stock, it's just not particularly great. I would much recommend other Lamborghinis over this. You know, I'd recommend, say, the Diablo or something like that, because the Countach itself isn't a particularly great vehicle to drive, but nevertheless it is a Lamborghini, so it may do well around this track. We don't know. We'll find out towards the end of the show. Next up we have the Audi RS5 Coupe, 442 horsepower, 3,830 pounds of weight. Now, this is another one of those four-wheel drive Audis, and usually Audis seem to group together. We saw it in Forza 5, which was between, I believe it was the RS4, the RS5 and the RS7 were all relatively close to each other. Here in Forza 6, the RS4 Avant and the RS7 Sportsback are very close together. So let's see if the RS5 can get into that group as well this time around. As far as the car is to drive, it is a pretty understeery four-wheel drive Audi. There's nothing really dramatic to say about it. Straight line speed is pretty decent, 442 horsepower. It is quite a lot. One thing you will find with these cars today is they all have relatively the same horsepower figures, and they're all pretty close when it comes to weight. They're all about 3,500 pounds. They all have around 420 horsepower. So yeah, it should be a pretty even playing field this week. But the RS5, it's decent enough. I was never personally a huge fan of the RS5. I've always preferred the RS7, the RS4 Avant, and they're the vehicles which I would suggest you use over this one, specifically the RS4 Avant, because that's a very good driving vehicle. The RS5 is a little bit more understeery than the Avant, and I probably wouldn't recommend it. Next up we have the Chevrolet Corvette ZR1. This is a C4 generation of Corvette, 405 horsepower, 3,505 pounds. This is by far and away the best vehicle we had here today. This car is so nice to drive, it's unreal. I've driven C4 Vettes in the past, and they've always appeared to be very good handling vehicles, and this one definitely is no exception. This is a superb handling vehicle, to be honest with you. It is really good. The turning grip is great coming out the corners. There's no real wheel spin to worry about. Straight line speed is decent enough, 405 horsepower. Does mean it's one of the lesser powerful vehicles here today, but it still is pretty darn decent. You can see I do get things a little wrong coming out of Hammerhead there, perhaps trying to push it a little bit too much, but to be honest with you, the C4 doesn't really need pushing. It is very quick. It is just, it's such a great vehicle to drive this one, and I've never really understood why the C4 Corvette in particular is always a really good driving vehicle in games, but it just is. That's just the way it is. And yeah, I really liked driving this vehicle. If there's any vehicle that you are going to use after seeing this show today, make sure it's this one, because I promise you will be pleasantly surprised. Next up we have the Lexus ISF, 416 horsepower, 3,780 pounds of weight. Now, the ISF didn't go around with the rest of the super saloons. We've had BMW M5s, Audi RS4s, so on and so forth go around the track before. We'd never had the ISF go around. We did have the IS350 go around, however that car wasn't particularly quick, although then again that is a much lesser powerful vehicle. The ISF to drive, it's okay. It drives like a rear wheel drive super saloon really should. It's pretty decent to drive overall. 416 horsepower when it comes to super saloons isn't a lot, but it does mean it does handle a bit nicer than, say, the BMW M5. However, again, I would still probably advise you go with the Audis over the ISF. Admittedly, I believe the ISF is actually quite cheap, quite a lot cheaper than the RS4 of that. Actually, I believe it's about 50,000 credits cheaper. But still, the RS4 is the better overall vehicle. The ISF certainly isn't bad, however. It just isn't particularly exciting. I mean, it's not like the LFA, for example, because that thing has a rorty engine and it's very exciting. The ISF just isn't. It's got just a V8 in it. It drives alright. That's really all I can say about the ISF. Next up, we have the Mercedes-Benz SLK 55 AMG, 415 horsepower, 3,527 pounds of weight. Now, we've had a BMW Z4 go around. That's probably the closest rival to the SLK 55. To drive, it isn't bad. It isn't nearly as crazy as most of the offerings from AMG. This thing isn't trying to get sideways all the time. It does feel a little bit heavy. It isn't a bad vehicle to drive. As you can see, I kicked it down into second there. The rear end will come out. The rear end will come out on this vehicle, of course. You've got to remember, this is an AMG. It's still bonkers. But it isn't quite as bonkers as, you know, say the SL65 Black or anything of that sort. It's one of the more subdued AMG cars. That being said, it still isn't the best. If you want a great driving Mercedes, then you definitely want to be looking at the E63 AMG. Admittedly, that car is many classes up from this one, but that is a very, very good handling vehicle. The SLK 55, again, is one of those cars that isn't bad, but it really isn't particularly memorable to drive. I would probably suggest going for the Z4 over this. The Z4 is a slightly nicer handling vehicle, but nevertheless the SLK isn't bad. Next up, we have the BMW Z8, 394 horsepower, 3,494 pounds of weight. Now, the BMW Z8 is probably one of the more interesting cars BMW ever made. It is very, very strange looking. In the cockpit view, all of the gauges are mounted in the centre. Admittedly, this car doesn't have the same cockpit issues that it did have in Forza Motorsport 5, if you remember on that game. It had like a really bad reflection, I think, and there was a lot of sun glare. It doesn't have that in this game, which is nice. So that means the Z8 is actually drivable now in the interior view. So how does the Z8 actually drive? Well, it's pretty decent. Same engine in this as you'd get in an E39. So yeah, it does handle quite a bit like the E39. A little bit wanting to go sideways every now and again, but it's relatively controlled. Probably could make a good drift car if you put enough power into this thing. The Z8 isn't a bad car to drive, I do have to say. It's one of the better vehicles here to drive, certainly. I would say get this over the SLK 55. Personally, I prefer driving this vehicle here today, but will it be quicker? Well, I guess we'll find out towards the end of the show. Of course, it does have slightly less power than the SLK, but it is a little bit lighter, which is good. Yeah, I liked my time in the Z8, pretty good car to drive. Next up, we have probably my least favourite car here today. This is the Chevrolet Supersport, 415 horsepower, 3,975 pounds of weight. This is the heaviest vehicle here today. Now, the Supersport was supposed to go against the 300C in a bit of a face-off I had planned. Unfortunately, it never came to fruition. So how does the Supersport actually drive? Well, if you drive in cockpit mode, then don't with this car, because my god, it's awful. I don't know what it is about some of these Chevrolets. I don't know if it's just the shape of the wheel and the way the wheel turns. It's a little bit awkward. But this car in cockpit mode is not a particularly nice place to be. It is really disorientating. I believe I actually ended up driving quite a bit of this on the hood cam, which I usually do try to avoid, but there's nothing I can really do about it because the interior view is pretty bad on this vehicle. However, how does it actually drive? It wants to spin its wheels everywhere. It is a very, very slidey car, this one. It is definitely a muscle car, you can tell that much. A little bit better handling than the 2016 Camaro we had out a few weeks ago, but still ultimately not the greatest vehicle to drive in my opinion. I would recommend the 300C over this. I mean, the 300C I mean, I guess the 300C slides a bit more, but the 300C is a bit more predictable and a bit more fun. The SS isn't really all that much fun, unfortunately. And finally today we have the Nissan 370Z, 332 horsepower, 3,267 pounds of weight. This is the lightest car here today. It's also the least powerful. So I've spoke about neutral handling vehicles in the past. I've used it in reference to, I believe it was the Mazda RX-7, Honda S2000. The 370Z also falls into that category. This thing is extremely neutral to drive. It honestly doesn't really have that much feeling in anything that really goes on. It will try to kick out occasionally, but it's very controllable when it does. It isn't particularly great through the corners, but it isn't bad. Straight line speed, it's okay. Again, it's the least powerful car here today, but it still isn't bad. 332 horsepower certainly isn't, you know, 332 horsepower doesn't mean this thing's a slouch. There we go. But it isn't, I don't know, it's just pretty unremarkable, but the 370Z is still pretty decent. I'd still recommend having a go with it. It's not a bad vehicle to drive by any stretch of the imagination, just not the most interesting, unfortunately. But nevertheless, the 370Z is a car I assume most people are wanting to go around for a little bit now. I know these cars are popular. I do personally kind of like the 370Z. It's a little bit strange looking. I much prefer it with the Nismo body kit. But nevertheless, not a bad looking car. Anyways, let's get on to the times, and the quickest car today was the Corvette C4 with a 121.001. It's quicker than an Audi RS4, Audi RS7, which bear in mind the RS7 is an A-class car. Quicker than a Lotus Elise, BMW M5. That vehicle is very quick. I definitely recommend giving that one a go. It also beats a C5 Corvette as well, that's worth mentioning. The next car on our list is the Lamborghini Countach 121.663. Not a bad time. Audi RS5 121.851, one little bit quicker than 2016 Camaro. Unfortunately, it doesn't go with the Audi stable, so it is a bit down on those guys. However, it is quicker than the RS4. The Lexus ISF goes into 121st with a 122.343, fractionally beating out an XFRS, although I do prefer the XFRS personally. Yeah, not a bad time. The SLK 55 goes into 125th with a 122.663, a little bit quicker than a BMW Z4, although not by much. It's also quicker than the Rocket. 370Z goes into 135th with a 123.267. Chevrolet Supersport goes into 138th with a 123.481, and the slowest car here today, unfortunately, was the BMW Z8 with a 123.562. Still quicker than a Mercedes-Benz A45 AMG, which is the second quickest hot hatch we've ever had, and quicker than a 2015 Mustang. Still a pretty good car, the Z8. I definitely still would recommend that over the SLK, and the best car here today by far was the Corvette C4. That thing is amazing to drive. Anyways, friends, that's it for today's episode of the Forza Top Gear Laps. I do hope you've enjoyed. In the next episode, we're going to be taking a look at some random C-Class cars, so join me for that. Anyways, friends, I want to thank you all very much for watching. My name's been the Real Emile, and until next time, farewell.